although earlier in July, we were really the most stringent. The lockdown in the Philippines is not only stringent, but stingy in terms of government response. For example, public transport was closed down with very strict bans on alternatives such as jeeps and tricycles, which are the more common modes of transportation for workers and students. No? And it also deprived thousands of drivers of their livelihoods. No? Even private motorcycles, they came up with all kinds of rules, but private cars, there were no restrictions. The main point that I'm trying to make is that with public transport closed down, many people could not move around, which is what they wanted, but it still put people at a great disadvantage. Social amelioration packages were given only twice throughout this long lockdown. And the first one was not until 2 months after the lockdown and was marred by corruption, so much so that the government itself declared that it would not be passed on through local governments because the local officials were stealing from these packages. The Philippines has very few social safety nets. We have no unemployment insurance. And in this lockdown, there were no rescue packages for small-scale businesses. No? Not only that, government decided they wanted to tax even small online businesses. No? The weak national health insurance was further emasculated with revelations just 2 weeks ago of massive plunder, so much so that the National Health Insurance Corporation might be bankrupt by next year. This is the worst time that it could happen, given that we have COVID. And aggravating all of this, of course, is the militarization of the management of COVID-19. Before the pandemic started, key cabinet positions had been given to the military, who now constitute the interagency task force that is handling COVID management. The task force is headed by a former military man, as well as other officials, military officials, who head the National Health Insurance System, Department of Social Welfare, Office of Civil Defense, even the Department of Information, Communications, and Technology. All of these are military people. And of course, you have the Department of National Defense, which would be the soldiers, and the Philippine National Police. I put here, having military men in charge of diagnosing the medical problem is really a form of medical malpractice. They are just not trained to do this. No? And so it's not surprising that their take on the problem was to blame victims, no? To blame the poor in particular, accusing them of being stubborn, disobedient, and defiant. And it is also not surprising that they decided to use fear and intimidation as the main driving forces for COVID-19 strategy, rather and neglecting the more important needs of testing, contact tracing, and tracking, and to develop a rights-based, welfare-oriented, comprehensive program. The result was shotgun therapy. Since the epidemiology was so poorly done, the military ended up addressing the outbreaks without understanding the social dynamics of infection, such as urban poor congestion. We found that most of the clusters, of course, are in the urban poor communities, and that people could not be quarantined because they had to leave homes to find ways to survive. I have a few photographs here. Even the police, which is a civilian force, was militarized. Their uniforms were changed. It took me a while. I didn't realize that they were still the police, but they were put in camouflage uniforms. No? And you can see pictures of two of them in an urban poor community. You can see the way they are projected there to intimidate people. In some urban poor areas, they even sent in armored personal carriers to control people. The idea always is that the poor have to be threatened, they have to be intimidated. So this is really overkill. In fact, in one of the urban poor communities, they sent in 1,000 police, many of them in motorcycles, to add to the effect. And militarization was accompanied by a systematic dismantling of democratic institutions. This had started even before the pandemic and was epitomized by the war on drugs. The government's own figures covering the period June 2016 to 2019, the first 3 years of the current president, Rodrigo Duterte, reported almost 200,000 arrests and 5,500 deaths during police operations. But human rights groups have estimated the deaths to be closer to 20,000. So this is even before the pandemic. An example, of course, with the war on drugs. This is a photograph of the jail in Quezon City before the lockdown. And you can see here the implications when the pandemic broke out. It was not surprising that COVID raced through the prisons. Many people were infected and quite a number of deaths were reported. The arrests for quarantine violations, more than 200,000 violations were reported by the police, with more than 70,000 arrests as of last month. And some of these so-called violations were as simple as sitting in front of one's homes. Again, if you have the military handling this, they could not understand that by doing this, by making people stay within their homes, their very, very congested homes, they were actually contributing to the distribution, to the spread of the virus, because the people were so closely together, there was no way they could have done physical distancing. Another example here was a journalist who was arrested because he had taken his mask down to drink and was accused of violating the mask regulations. There were also arrests. This is a photograph of an LGBT rally in June. 20 of the rally is, this was a pride march, and 20 of them were arrested. During the lockdown too, the government took advantage of the lockdown to pass a new anti-terrorism law that allows warrantless arrest and detention without charges up to 24 days, among other measures. The country's largest media outfit, ABS-CBN, was closed down on trumped-up charges, depriving people of their main source of information. And generally, you have the harassment of activists and mass movement leaders. There's a very good CNN podcast that covered this with many interviews with people who were affected. Very sadly, just 2 days before the lockdown, one of our comrades, Dr. Lourdes Tanco, who was a physician who spent her entire life serving the poor, was killed with a raid in the place she was living in. This was on March 13, and by that time, people were so confused about the impending lockdown. There's almost nothing that could be done. She was 67 years old. Just very recently, on August 10, Randy Achanis, a peasant leader and a representative to the peace panel talks from the National Democratic Front, was killed, age 72. I want to emphasize these were senior citizens, but the military was merciless in the way they handled this. Of course, they said that with Dr. Tanco that she had resisted arrest, which of course we know is no reason for the assassination. If we go back to the Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker, you will see here that the militarization just did not work. The black line here refers to the reported infections, and you can see that it just kept going up. And the red line is the stringency of government measures. So for all the military their terrible measures of intimidation, this certainly did not help with controlling the infections. I actually have figures that we will have to, the epidemiological figures would have shown this more clearly, but there was just no time to prepare it. But in some of the areas where you had the armored personnel carriers, the infection rates actually doubled or even tripled, and the government has not released those figures. So today, as of today, we have the highest figures in Southeast Asia with almost 200,000 infections and 3,000 deaths. My last slide here is to warn about the long-term dangers of militarization. For a long time now in the Philippines, we have referred to the military operations as utak pulbura. Pulbura is the Spanish word for gunpowder, and utak is brain. When you have gunpowder-brained people running the country, what we see is not just brute force as the solution, but is the inability for them to even imagine other perspectives and options, the notions of social responsibility, of poverty fueling the epidemic. And we are particularly worried because we had, of course, the period of martial law and dictatorship from 1972 to 1986, and under the current president, creeping authoritarianism. And we worry about the long-term impact, which is that the government and even the citizenry might begin to get used to military approaches as the default response to serious social problems. All of it, of course, ineffective, and all of it destroying the last vestiges of democracy in the Philippines. This ends my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Michael Tan. We now proceed to our second speaker. Yemen is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today, with more than 24 million people, or some 80% of the population, in need of humanitarian assistance, including more than 12 million children. Since the conflict escalated in March 2015, the country has become a living hell for the country's children. With COVID-19 now spreading rapidly, Yemen is facing an emergency within an emergency. Sanitation and clean water are in short supply. Only half of health facilities are functioning, and many that remain operational lack basic equipment like masks and gloves. To present the country's situation is no less than the PHM Coordinator Country Circle in Yemen. She currently works for the University of Aden, and she is volunteer in the Association of Health for All in Yemen. Let us all welcome Elham Jameel.
I have a small interpretation announcement. Elham will be speaking in Arabic. So everyone who would like to listen in into English needs to go to the interpretation services and click on the English button. Thank you so much. Just to repeat, Elham will be speaking in Arabic. You will have to go to interpretation icon, which is at the bottom of your screen, and click on the English button. Thank you. Elham.
السلام عليكم. أنا ممثلة صحة الشعوب في اليمن إلهام. أتشرف بالانضمام إليكم في هذا المؤتمر لمناقشة الوضع الصحي في اليمن، خصوصاً أثناء الحرب واستمرارها. لقد بدأت الحرب في 26 مارس 2015، ولكن الحرب حالياً خرجت عن مسارها الذي بدأت من أجله. فقد تفرعت الحرب وأصبحت عدة حروب وصراعات يغذيها الفساد. فالحرب أصبح مصدر رزق للفاسدين الذين أصبحوا لا يريدون أن تنتهي الحرب، فخلقوا حروب فرعية بين عدة فئات، بين عدة تجمعات وقبائل في مختلف مناطق اليمن في الشمال والجنوب. الحرب انتجت تدمير اليمن وتشريد الملايين في اليمن. ألو.
There is a small issue with the Spanish.
هل يتم سماعي أم انقطع الاتصال؟
Two minutes. I would request Elham to pause for 2 minutes. He's hanging there.
إلهام لو تقدري تستني فقط دقيقتين. في مشكلة في الترجمة، دقيقتين فقط يا إلهام.
Can Elham start from the starting?
Okay.
Really sorry, but there was a problem with the Spanish interpretation. We would request Elham to start again. Really sorry for this.
معلش يا إلهام، كان في مشكلة في الترجمة الإسبانية، فلو تسمحي تبدأي من الأول تاني.
اليمن، بدأت الحرب في اليمن في 26 مارس 2015. الحرب انحرفت عن مسارها منذ بدءها، فقد بدأت لهدف معين، ولكن الآن الحرب في اليمن لم تعد حرب واحدة، بل أصبحت حروب متعددة بين عدة فئات وعدة جماعات في عدة مناطق لعدة أهداف: الفساد المستشري في اليمن، وفي المسؤولين، وفي عدة جهات المتنفذة، والذين تمثل الحرب لهم مصدر دخل ومصدر دخل مهول، أصبحوا لا يريدون أن تنتهي الحرب، بل يسعون لتغذية هذه الصراعات في كل المناطق، سواء المناطق التي تحت سيطرة الحكومة الشرعية أو المناطق التي لا تسيطر عليها الحكومة الشرعية. هذه الحروب ضحيتها فقط هم اليمنيون البسطاء الذين دمرت بنيتهم التحتية، دمرت المرافق الصحية، دمرت المنازل، شرد الكثير والملايين من اليمنيين من منازلهم. فوفقا للإحصاءات، اللجنة الوحدة التنفيذية للنازحين التي كانت من 2015 إلى مايو 2017، فقد بلغ عدد النازحين في اليمن 2,442,289 نازح في الداخل، موزعون على عدة محافظات ومناطق آمنة. بلغت نسبة الرجال منها 22%، و23% هي نسبة النساء من هؤلاء النازحين، بينما بلغ الأطفال الذكور 28%، و27% من الأطفال البنات. غير أن هناك يوجد كذلك لاجئين في الخارج، عددهم تقريبا 212,000 ما بين عالقين وهاربين من حدة الصراعات. الصراعات تسببت في إيقاف عجلة الاقتصاد بشكل كامل بسبب الحظر القوي، بسبب وضع اليمن تحت البند السابع، فقد تم إيقاف تصدير النفط والغاز اليمني اللذان كانا يعتبران المصدر الرئيسي للدخل القومي. كذلك الكثير من المزارعين الذين كانوا يعتمدون في دخلهم على الأراضي الزراعية التي كانت تزود المواطنين بالمواد الغذائية، الفواكه والخضروات، تم ترحيلهم من أراضيهم، تم تدمير أراضيهم وزراعة الكثير من الأراضي بالألغام. الكثير من اليمنيين أصبحوا أكثر فقراً وأكثر معاناة بسبب أن الكثير منهم يعتمد في معيشته على الدخل اليومي الذي أصبح غير يعني انتهى بسبب الحرب، بسبب نزوحهم من منطقة إلى أخرى، بسبب توقف كثير من المهن. مثال على ذلك الصيادين الذين أصبحوا لا يستطيعون الصيد لاستهدافهم في البحر من قبل عدة جهات ولمنعهم من الاصطياد إلى حدود معينة. بالتالي هذا انعكس أيضا على الغذاء في الداخل، فكان هو مصدر رزق للكثير من الصيادين، في الوقت نفسه هو غذاء لليمنيين في الداخل الذين يعانون من الحصار. هناك تدمير كبير للبنية التحتية، فالكهرباء لم تعد تعمل بالشكل المطلوب، مما أثر بالذات على الأمراض، ذوي الأمراض المزمنة، حيث أن الحرارة تفوق 40 درجة أدى هذه الانقطاعات إلى تفاقم صحتهم، بالإضافة إلى انعدام الدواء. ازدياد حالات الفقر في اليمن وانعدام الأمن الغذائي، حيث أن العديد من السكان يعانون من الفقر ومن انعدام الأمن الغذائي. فهناك أكثر من 20 مليون نسمة مهددون يعانون من انعدام الأمن الغذائي، بينهم 8 مليون و400 يمني في حالة انعدام أمن غذائي حاد. كذلك 7 ملايين يمني مشرفون على دخول مرحلة المجاعة. الأطفال كذلك يعانون من سوء التغذية. الأمهات تحتاج والحوامل إلى مكملات غذائية بسبب انعدام التغذية الجيدة. إن الحرب واستمرارها هي استمرار تدمير اليمن شمالا وجنوبا. بالنسبة للمرافق الصحية في اليمن، فقد كان القطاع الصحي قطاع هش. أظهرت الحرب مدى هشاشته، فقد دمرت الحرب الكثير من المرافق الصحية، والبعض منها تحول إلى تكونات عسكرية، وترحل الكثير من العاملين في القطاع الصحي، بحيث أنه أصبح العاملون في كثير من المناطق لا يستلمون رواتبهم أو يستلمون نصفها. البعض قتل أثناء الحرب، وانعدام الأدوية بسبب الحصار، وانعدام وإقفال الموانئ البرية والبحرية. هذا كله فاقم في الوضع، وخصوصا بعد انتشار بعد حصول كوارث السيول. كوارث السيول التي حصلت في العديد من المناطق يعني أظهرت مدى هشاشة النظام والحكومة بشكل كبير، حيث إنها لم يكن لها أي دور فعال في إغاثة المنكوبين. فقد تم تدمير منازلهم وتعرضهم للكثير من الأمراض، ولولا تدخل المنظمات الدولية وتدخل منظمات المجتمع المدني، كذلك تدخل رجال الخير في الداخل والخارج، فقد خففوا من وطأة هذه الكوارث ولم ينهوها، لأنها إنهاها يحتاج إلى دولة. فبعد السيول انتشرت العديد من الأمراض ومنها الطاعون، وقد كانت حمى الضنك والكوليرا نصيب كبير، حيث بلغت تقريبا 2,500,000 مصاب بالكوليرا في اليمن وفقا للإحصائيات حتى 2017. فالكوليرا أصبحت منتشرة بشكل كبير، وهناك أمراض لم تكن موجودة في اليمن وانتشرت بشكل كبير بسبب الحرب الدائرة والمستمرة والتي لم تنتهي ولا توجد أي معالم لنهايتها. انتشرت الأمراض أولاً بسبب تدمير مرافق الصرف الصحي، فعدم وجود الماء وعدم تصريف الصرف الصحي بشكل جيد، فالمجاري منتشرة في كثير من الأماكن جراء تدمير مرافق الصرف الصحي. المياه تكاد معدومة، ففي المناطق الحضرية الأكثر حظاً التي تعتبر أكثر حظاً فإن الماء يأتي ساعات معدودة كل 3 أو 4 أيام. يقوم المواطنون بتخزين الماء. أثناء التخزين ليس الجميع قادر على تخزين الماء بالشكل الجيد أو بالشكل الصحي المطلوب، فهناك الكثير ليس لديهم الإمكانيات المادية بسبب الظروف الاقتصادية التي أنتجتها الحرب، بسبب الفقر، بسبب الجوع، أن يقوموا بخزن الماء بالشكل المطلوب. هذا بدوره يؤثر في تلوث المياه وبالتالي زيادة انتشار الأمراض. إن الوضع في اليمن كارثي، وخصوصاً بعد انتشار وباء كورونا في اليمن. فخلال شهر مايو يونيو 2020 كانت عدد الوفيات مرتفعة بشكل كبير جداً، حيث إنه كان في اليوم الواحد في محافظة عدن فقط عدد الوفيات ما بين 50 إلى 90، ولا توجد أي جهات رسمية تصدر بيانات شفافة للمواطنين عن سبب الوفيات، عن أسبابها، لتوعية الناس لكي يقوموا بأخذ الإجراءات المناسبة والجلوس في منازلهم. مع العلم أن الكثير من المواطنين أثناء الحجر لم يستطيعوا المكوث في منازلهم لأنهم يعتمدون في حياتهم على العمل بالأجر اليومي. كذلك انقطاع الكهرباء بشكل مستمر، ارتفاع درجة الحرارة، انعدام الماء، انعدام الخدمات الأساسية، انعدام الغذاء، اضطر المواطنين الخروج من المنازل لكسب لقمة العيش حتى وإن كان على حساب حياتهم وتعرضهم لخطر الإصابة. فكانت لا توجد إجراءات مشددة. المواطنون في الأسواق، المواطنون في كل مكان، لا يوجد دور فعال للقطاع الصحي أو للحكومة بشكل عام في اليمن. فالمأساة ليست في القطاع الصحي فقط، إنما الجانب الاقتصادي الذي تراكم، ارتفاع أسعار الصرف بشكل جنوني، انعدام ارتفاع أسعار المواد الغذائية في ظل انعدام المرتبات، في ظل ضعف المرتبات، بينما الحكومة مقيمة في الرياض تستلم مرتباتها بالعملات الصعبة، يعني تعيش في ظروف في منأى عن الشعب ومعاناته. معاناة اليمنيين والأمراض المنتشرة وعدد الوفيات والمشردين والمخيمات التي لا نستطيع أن نسميها مخيمات لأنها لا تليق حتى بالحيوانات. فالظروف الموجودة في المخيمات سيئة جدا، لا مستوى نظافة، لا عدم توفر أدنى معايير الإنسانية فيها. كذلك بالنسبة للقطاع الصحي، فمثلا أثناء جائحة كورونا قامت جميع المرافق الصحية الحكومية والخاصة بإغلاق أبوابها أمام المواطنين. فكان المواطن لا يمتلك إلا أن يحجر نفسه في بيته، أن يقدم لنفسه العلاجات والغذاء، فمن استطاع أن ينجو نجا فمن لم يستطيع تقاعد. أغلب المستشفيات ولكن حين تدخلت منظمة أطباء بلا حدود الفرنسية خفت وطأة الوفيات، لكن كذلك لم يتم إعلان أي نتائج أو تصريحات شفافة توضح سبب الوفيات المتزايدة، توعي المواطنين. الوضع الصحي في المستشفيات لا زال حتى الآن سيء جدا. مستوى النظافة في المستشفيات ضعيف جدا. لا توجد أدوية كافية. الأمراض المزمنة أصحابها لا يجدون الرعاية والاهتمام، لا يجدون الدواء في ظل هذه الأوضاع. فاليمن بحاجة أولاً لكي يتحسن الوضع الصحي بها إلى إيقاف الحرب. إيقاف الحرب هو المطلب الأساسي لصحة الشعوب في اليمن، لكي يستطيع القطاع الصحي أن يؤدي دوره بالشكل المطلوب، لكي يستطيع الاقتصاد أن يتعافى. فإذا تعافى الاقتصاد تعافى بدوره بقية القطاعات. فالمواطنين لا يستطيعون توفير الغذاء، ولا يوجد من يقوم بتوفير الغذاء لهم. الفساد المستشري في البلاد جعل حتى المساعدات الإنسانية التي تقدم لا تخلو من دخول الفساد بها، فبعضها يصل إلى المستهدفين والكثير منها لا يصل إلى الفئات المستهدفة. الأمراض في اليمن ظهرت أمراض كثيرة وهي في ازدياد، وخصوصا في هذه الأيام هناك حالات في لبعض الإسهالات وبعض الأمراض في ازدياد. لا يوجد تحديد ما هي بالضبط، لأنه لا توجد فحوصات كافية، لا توجد مراكز عناية حقيقية، لا توجد تعطي تقارير شفافة وفعلية توضح حقيقة الوضع الصحي في اليمن. ويعني نكرر ونوصي بضرورة المناشدة لإيقاف الحرب في اليمن وإيقاف الصراعات التي أصبحت بؤرها منتشرة في كل مكان، والتي أصبح الفقراء هم الضحية، هم من يعانون الفقر، هم من يموتون، هم من يتعرضون للأمراض، هم من أصبحوا الكثير منهم معاقين بسبب الألغام المنتشرة، بسبب القذائف. أصبح الكثير منا غير آمن حتى في منزل. نتمنى الاهتمام بالقطاع الصحي في اليمن، نتمنى الاهتمام بالفئات المهمشة والفئات الفقيرة والفئات التي رحلت وشردت من ديارها بتوفير الغذاء وتوفير الدواء لذوي الأمراض المزمنة. الاهتمام بقطاع الكهرباء والمياه، لأنه لا نستطيع أن نوقف الأمراض طالما أن المياه ملوثة وغير متوفرة.
Thank you, Elham. We feel you. Allahu Akbar. For our next presentation, we have a professor and researcher at the American University of Beirut, and also the co-chair of the Lancet American University of Beirut Commission on Health of Syrian Refugees. Also the founding chair of the steering group of the Global Alliance on War, Conflict, and Health, formally launched in Geneva last May 2020. Thank God he is here, because on August 4, there was a big explosion in Lebanon. So glad you're here, Dr. Summer Jabour.
Thank you very much.
Just before
hello.
I'm sorry. So anyone who has having interpretation changes can go to the interpretation icon and change it because I see some messages. Sorry. You can deactivate your interpretation and click on the off button now. Thank you so much.
Hello, colleagues. I hope everyone can hear and that you see the screen. I am from Syria and live and work in Lebanon. So I will be speaking about how the pandemic has unfolded in both countries and review the insights that that this review would bring to the struggle to resist the militarization of the response. I have been part of the PHM for many years, and I'm privileged to be here. Now, we discuss Syria and Lebanon together not because these countries are bound by proximity and history, but because they're already bounded by a brutal conflict that straddled the borders between the two countries, with actors crossing borders to fight, and with dependency of conflict actors on flow of resources across those borders. Our work in the Lancet AUB Commission on Syria looks at the various ways in which conflict and health intersect, and the COVID-19 pandemic and the response to it in our region, not just in Syria and Lebanon, provide the lens through which we can really begin to interrogate those intersections. And I'm really grateful to the PHM's War and Conflict Thematic Circle for facilitating this exchange about a topic. It's really overdue. All too often, the global discussions of conflict and COVID-19 are framed in so-called humanitarian terms, but this, as important as it is, obscures a serious understanding of the underlying politics of the pandemic and the response to it. And it's not a surprise that PHM steps forward to take on this topic head on and discuss it as it should be. Furthermore, the perspectives of people working in affected countries and region are not common, and regions are not commonly brought in to inform the understanding and the response to this pandemic. So I'm really grateful to PHM and its thematic circle for doing this. Now, in my brief intervention, I will build on what Dr. Jameel has discussed. Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon are linked in many ways beyond just being Arab countries. All three countries have experienced popular uprisings against corrupt regimes. Lebanon, where I live now, came in late in October 2019, but the uprisings in Yemen and Syria started in 2011 as part of the wave of Arab Spring of 2010-2011. These uprisings have not succeeded to bring in change. Syria, like Yemen, descended into chaos and violence because mainly of the unleashing of monumental counter-revolutionary forces that have exploited a complex geopolitical struggle over the control of the region and its resources. And the people are paying the price for that. When you bring an epidemic on top of such a complex conflict, you could understand the consequences. It becomes almost inevitable that there would be a militarization of the response to the pandemic. And this context is also important to inform how we can possibly resist such militarization. Now, in looking at the COVID pandemic situation in Syria particularly, but also in Lebanon, I'd like to bring attention to three key issues. The first is how the course of the pandemic itself is itself militarized. Second is that how the response of the authorities to the pandemic, including through mobilization of international resources, is also militarized and used as a political tool of control. And third, draw attention to how local health and human rights advocates have attempted to resist this militarization and mount a grassroots response to community needs. So in the few minutes that I have remaining, I will try to clarify these three issues, building on the case of Syria and Lebanon, but perhaps towards a broader understanding that can inform our cross-country and cross-regional joint struggle for people's health. Now, with regards to Syria, the first documented cases, the first documented case of COVID-19 was on March 22nd. Now, this very situation was contested from the beginning, because there were reports based on observations by clinical providers of many patients that had symptoms suggestive of COVID-19, but testing was not available, and there was a severe pressure by the authorities to really suppress any public discussions of the emergence of COVID-19. At some point, the health minister declared triumphantly on television interview that the army has crushed the terrorists. He was referring to rebels, and it will crush COVID-19. So this is not the military speaking. This is the health minister speaking about that COVID-19 would not dare even enter the country. How is this linked to the conflict itself and the geopolitical dimensions of the conflict? Very easily, we can understand those links when we know that Syria has a lot of fighters who are brought in by Iran, who had by then had already shown a great rise of cases, and there were many sources discussing the rise of COVID-19 cases or suspected cases in areas where families of soldiers or affected communities reside. So this militarization of information flow about the pandemic was the first sign of an unfortunate trajectory. The next chapter in this militarization came with the intimidation that that healthcare providers were under not to reveal any information regarding the COVID-19. Followed by further intimidation that the patients with suspected or confirmed COVID-19 cases were actually subjected to, in order not to disclose information. Many of those patients were put in government isolation that were in dire conditions, further contributing to the health deterioration. Unfortunately, we do not have adequate information about the outcomes of these trends because of the suppression of information. Now, this suppression has reached the point where right now Syria has declared about 1,300 cases of COVID-19, while a recent study based on various assumptions by colleagues, Syrian colleagues from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, estimated about 35,000 cases. So this is a profound difference between 1,300 and 35,000 cases that show us how serious the matter is for affected communities where effective public health measures and personal measures such as protective equipment are either unavailable, or many people are not informed to use them to protect themselves. This becomes even more traumatic when we know that Syria is really not now a single country, but rather a country that divided into territorial control with different factions. We have the government-controlled areas, which is the largest part, but we also have the northwest part, which is controlled by rebels with support from Turkey, and the northeast part, which is controlled by the by a coalition supported by the U.S. U.S. administration. So these parts host, particularly northeast and northwest, host large numbers of refugees that have no access to this. And this brings us to the second point about the response. One of the key points of contention during the past few weeks had been the discussion around allowing cross-border humanitarian access to continue through various points to the northeast and the northwest of the country. Unfortunately, the government of Syria, with support from Russia and China, who enacted 2 vetoes, managed to reduce cross-border access to only 1 point, essentially depriving affected communities in the northeast and the northwest, but particularly the northeast, of access to humanitarian aid that is essential to fighting this pandemic. So obviously this reflects how the government response of diverting international support to areas only under control and depriving the others is really an important demonstration of the militarization of the response to the pandemic. Now, the third point concerns about how it has not all been gloomy, but rather that we have seen health and humanitarian humanitarian providers as well as human rights advocates rise up to the challenge and attempt to mobilize against all odds to address the COVID pandemic and its consequences. This has not been possible in government-controlled areas because of the restriction of the government, but we have seen this in the northwest and the northeast of the country, where the local health authorities or advocates have really kind of mobilized some measure of local response that have done the best with the resources that are available. For example, in northwest Syria, doing training sessions for healthcare providers, identifying in very crowded refugee camps areas where cases can be isolated once detected, or doing isolation for high risk individuals, the very elderly with multiple comorbidities of this. So, so this is the situation in Syria. In Lebanon, obviously, we had the popular uprising in October 2019 against a very corrupt regime that has always been accused of criminal mismanagement and negligence. But this criminal mismanagement has become quite clear in the Beirut explosions, whereby 2,700 tons of explosive material were stored in a civilian area, largely, or in a port surrounded by civilian neighborhoods. And we discovered recently that a lot of those tons were actually stolen over the past few years. So it was not benign storage. It was storage with the aim of stealing and selling, perhaps to support the ongoing conflict in Syria as well, which provides a link between conflict and health again. Now, the COVID-19 response in Lebanon has been widely viewed with skepticism by health advocates because of the severity of the lockdown, which was thought to aim at suppressing public gatherings and re-emergence of large-scale demonstrations once the winter season was over in February, March of 2020. So, so I will conclude here with again reiterating the 4 issues that emerged from this examination and draw the implications for resisting the militarization. First is that we need to look at how an epidemic unfolds to understand how it is militarized and influenced by political choices made by parties to the conflict and dictated by really conflict development. So, so the resisting deliberate militarization should start here through using epidemic tracking to understand what we can term the political spread of an epidemic. Really, this is what it is, and we should call it as it is. And we need to demand that international health bodies, including WHO, speak truth to this spread. Second is that the approaches that the authorities used to control the pandemic were more influenced by a desire to assert political control over the affected population rather than by a true concern for the well-being of the population. We discussed this in Syria, where it's well illustrated with the restriction on media, intimidation of providers and affected people. So resisting the militarization here means that we need to agitate, and this is why the voice of PHM will be important, to ensure free public access to information about the epidemic spread, exposing and ending the intimidation of healthcare providers and affected people, and pressing to restore humanitarian access to communities, no matter which authority holds territorial control. And the third is that under difficult circumstances and with very limited resources, local health and human rights advocates are able to mobilize grassroots initiatives to address the needs of the affected communities. So resisting demilitarization here means understanding and lending material and moral support to their struggle. Again, many thanks to PHM and its War and Conflict thematic circle for organizing this webinar and for including me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samer. We truly must resist. From the Middle East and the Philippines, now we come to Latin America. Amid the pandemic, the Brazilian Health Ministry suffered an unprecedented intervention with the appointment of a general as interim minister. 3 months have passed and the balance so far is blind obedience to ideology to the detriment of science, the chase of technical staff, attempt to make up the statistics of COVID-19, and so on. However, this is not an isolated case, but the part of the broader process of militarization in the Jair Bolsonaro far-right government. To share their experience is the editor of Otrasod, a journalism project specialized in health based in Brazil. She is also a member of PHM Brazil, Ms. Maira Mathias. Hola.
Hi, I would like to thank the PHM for the kind invitation to join this webinar, especially my comrades Mathias Falcão, also from Brazil, and Maria Zuniga from Nicaragua. Brazil just completed 26 weeks since its first case of COVID-19. And so far, the country has accumulated more than 3.5 million cases and 115,000 deaths. These astonishing numbers place us as the second worst hit country in the pandemic so far. And although Brazil is known from its inequality, has a huge territory, and also a big population, most of this carnage happened because of the federal government, as the country is ruled by the right-wing politician, Jair Bolsonaro. Today I will try to explain why this failure also has to do with the militarization of the response carried out with the straight collaboration of the Brazilian army. The Ministry of Health has been under what some analysts are calling a military occupation for 18 weeks so far. This process started with the effort of Bolsonaro to pursue people that opposed his campaign of denial of the pandemic, including staff in his own government. First, he sacked a health minister who, despite being an advocate of privatization of our universal public health system, had been supporting a pro-science approach to the pandemic. And this layoff was not a simple thing to do at the time because Bolsonaro's popularity was declining because of his denial approach. And we had daily manifestations all over the country of people hitting pens in the windows and things like that. But from then on, Bolsonaro made it clear that the Ministry of Health would no longer has autonomy. He would undermine the autonomy of the ministry. And so he appointed as the next minister a doctor who promised him full alignment. But Bolsonaro did not trust him and imposed a nomination of a general of Brazilian army with no experience on health to the second most important position in the ministry. This general's name is Eduardo Pazuello, and a few weeks later, he would become the interim minister. As a matter of fact, today he completes 100 days in that position. And during all this time, he has guaranteed blind obedience to Bolsonaro. Pazuello took with him military personnel to the ministry. Now there are 20 of them holding important technical positions, and most of them have no expertise in the health field. this is serious because not even during the Brazilian dictatorship, which lasted 21 years, the Ministry of Health was commanded by the military. So you can imagine that many problems are happening because of this. And I will highlight three of them, 3 points to you. Starting with chloroquine. Chloroquine is that drug that treats malaria and other diseases and has been proven not only ineffective in the treatment of COVID-19, but also dangerous. But the first thing General Pazuello did when he took control was validate the use of this substance in the treatment of mild cases. This happened because months earlier, Bolsonaro imitated Donald Trump and clung to chloroquine to offer the population a solution of some sort, with the intention to convince people to break the isolation measures imposed by local governments. He has been planning for a long time to distribute chloroquine to every Brazilian and put pressure on the two previous ministers of health to adopt this idea, this protocol. And this was the reason of their resignation, because at that point, they already knew that the drug could not only be ineffective, but also dangerous. This was no problem for the general. In 1 week, he managed to release a document recommending the use of chloroquine for mild cases. The result of this endorsement was a huge wave of misinformation and millionaire spending for nothing, and showcases pretty much how a response to the pandemic can be led by ideology, being totally against science. We saw strong reactions here in Brazil, reactions of scientists, of justice, of congresspeople, control bodies of the state, media, as the clinical trials started to show the drug is ineffective. But none of this has managed to reverse the chloroquine policy. And only yesterday, Bolsonaro promoted an event called Winning the Battle Against COVID-19, that was in fact a celebration of chloroquine. Well, after that, General Pazuello invested against transparency of data, of infections and deaths caused by COVID-19. In Brazil, every day at 7 p.m., the statistics were released. And this began to delay until after the closing of the main newscasts. And in Brazil, Brazil is a country where the television is still important to raise public debate and so on. So a few days after this, the website with the data just went down and with no explanation. When it came back, was showing only the cases and deaths notified in the past 24 hours. And this maneuver won headlines all over the planet, because Brazil disappeared from the Johns Hopkins University ranking, and Bolsonaro confirmed that from then on it would always be like that. Finally, they decided that the ministry would no longer disclose the deaths as they were being notified, because Brazil has a problem in testing. So if a person dies today, this may appear in the statistics weeks later, or even a month or more later. So the deaths that they would disclose only the deaths that happened in the past 24 hours. Of course, is a small number. And the military in power wanted to smooth the numbers in that time, because they already knew that the peak of the infection would start soon. as it did. But it did not work because the data is sent to the ministry by local governments. So the local governments just created a new platform of their own. And also the Brazilian Supreme Court ruled against this decision, and they have to step back. And my last example has to do with the broader militarization process within the Bolsonaro government. And there are many examples of persecution of public workers and journalists based, they are using a law of the time of the dictatorship in Brazil that talks about threats to national order. And just to give you an idea, a cartoon that criticized Bolsonaro was considered such a threat to the national order. And this authoritarian approach is affecting the Brazilian response to the pandemic. And technical staff of the Ministry of Health were prohibited from disclosing any information to the press based on that law. These people told journalists and Congress members that they feared their cell phones were tapped. And also they are being challenged by the militaries on the bureaucracy routine because these people in meetings don't know nothing about public health, but they feel empowered to disagree based on common sense and opinion. This, however, is a broader process. Only this month, we learned that the Ministry of Justice produced a spy dossier on policemen because some of them put in their private social media an Antifa ribbon. And the dossier was deemed illegal by the Supreme Court again. They concluded there was no explanation other than the persecution of opponents of Bolsonaro. And finally, to end my presentation, it's important to understand that Bolsonaro has a military background. He was expelled from the army after the revelation that he was planning to explode military buildings. And he was a leader in the movement to raise salaries and became a politician short after this. So for 20 years, he has been elected by militaries because of this agenda of salaries and stuff like this. And he always defended the dictatorship. And he became this extreme right-wing bet for people who opposes and hates the left, the Workers' Party, Lula, Dilma legacy. And his election was only possible because of a coalition with the same army that despised him for so long, and also with liberals, new liberals, that are having a hard time now in his government. So this is a government full of militaries in power, positions, and ministries, and so on. It's a situation totally new since the democratization of Brazil. And this reflected very much of the Brazilian response to the pandemic so far. That's it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Maira. So we have finished with our 4 major speakers. We're down to 2 brief interventions from India and from Greece. Our next speaker will be Rajni Soren. She is a human rights lawyer and a member of JSA or the PHM India. Rajni?
Thank you, Jojo, and greetings to everyone. Yes, so the situation in India is not very different from what our friends from Lebanon, Philippines, Yemen, Brazil have been talking about. And like you know, India presently has a government that is led by a party that has absolute majority, unprecedented majority in India, and it is a majoritarian right-wing party. And ever since it has come to power in 2014, we have seen authoritarianism in different forms, and we have seen dismantling of democratic processes and institutions and laws. Most importantly, the most infamous moves by this government have been the taking away of the special status of Kashmir within the Indian constitution, and also trying to change the citizenship laws of the country, and trying to introduce citizenship on the basis of religion as part of the laws of the country. So when COVID-19 happened, and while we were grappling with all of these things, COVID-19 happened, and as trademark of the government, the response of the government to the pandemic was no different from earlier authoritarian measures and earlier authoritarian responses. So, like we've seen in other countries, in India as well, the management of the pandemic was not done by the Ministry of Health, but it was done by a ministry which is in charge of internal security, policing, and this is what was reflected in all the various measures that were taken. Now, the lockdown in India was announced in an extremely dramatic fashion. The Prime Minister came on television on the 24th of March at night, and he announced that there would be a lockdown from the next day. So he held a placard on national television and he said that do not step out of your houses. So this, like you know, was obviously very strange for a country like India, because he largely ignored that a lot of people in fact do not have houses in this country, and a lot of people live away from their homes in cities, on the streets, in huts, on rent, and that most people are hand to mouth, and that they would have nowhere to go if something like this was happen. So on the very next day, what you saw was something very disastrous, and from urban areas, migrant workers were out in the streets wanting to go back home since they had lost their employment and all of that. And because of this complete lockdown, what you saw was there was a complete shutdown of public transport, and what you saw was that people started walking on foot. So this chart that I have up here is not to so much tell you the numbers of the deaths etc. that have happened, but to actually give you an idea as to the kind of deaths that happened. So according to the government, some 9 million migrant workers have returned home ever since the lockdown, and because of this close down of the public transport, a lot of them had to walk on foot for hundreds of kilometers. So there were hundreds of deaths of people because they were walking by foot. And other than that, there were starvation deaths, and there were deaths due to lack of medical care. And then there were a lot of road accidents that took place because road or train accidents, because people chose to walk along highways and to walk along train tracks. So we had a lot of deaths that occurred on rail tracks as well. And then subsequently, when the government finally decided to arrange transport for these workers, even that was not done in a proper manner. And then you saw deaths taking place in government trains. So then you had those deaths as well. And once these migrant workers returned home, you assume that their plight would come to an end, but that was not what happened. These workers were made to stay in government quarantine centers, and there were a large number of deaths of people in these quarantine centers as well, because of lack of proper facilities or because of lack of medical aid to people suffering from other illnesses, or there were people in distress who committed suicides, etc. So there were a large number of deaths that took place in these quarantine centers as well. So one of the major crises that India dealt with immediately after the lockdown was the migrant workers crisis, and most of civil society was involved in handling the whole situation as to how do you help people reach back home, and how do you make sure that people are not starving in cities because of this lockdown, because of loss of livelihood. So that was the first major impact of the lockdown. Now, coming back to the whole issue of what sort of an authoritarian uh, attack did we see in our country. So like I said, we were already on that mode. In that mode, our country was already down the authoritarian track, and this only made things worse. To begin with, if you look at the fundamental rights and democratic freedoms that the Indian Constitution gives us, we saw a complete dismantling of that without any legal measures per se. So there was a complete ban on public religious gatherings, etc. However, what's important to note is that these bans were only for civil society, and these bans were not applicable to governments and to political party in power or to organizations close to the party. So while civil society was banned from moving on the streets, you would have the government holding government functions and programs, or religious functions and programs. And then there was complete restrictions on the freedom of movement. Like I said, there was ban on complete transport. And then Kashmir, that I spoke of earlier, continued to face these restrictions, especially in the form of restrictions on internet services. So even today, there is no 4G internet services in internet in Kashmir, which has had a huge impact on health services, on students, and on public at large. Then there was this issue of the right to privacy. So in the beginning and even today, when patients, there has been complete violation of the right to privacy of COVID-19 patients. In the beginning, you saw patients being stamped on their arms, or you saw their names being put up on government websites. And then there's also this issue of surveillance. So India had this has this app, which is a surveillance app to follow people's movements, and it has been made mandatory for a whole lot of issues for travel, etc. And so and which is very questionable, because it raises questions of right to privacy. It follows your movement, and there is no clarity as to how long the government will maintain this data. And there have been ethical hackers have pointed out that this data is being could be accessed by other parties as well. So there's that. And then we saw police excesses in the form of a lot of excesses by the police forces. And then we also saw targeting of social and political activists. So while the government was asking you to stay at home, they went ahead and targeted people who were known for their positions of dissent against the government. Then the other thing that happened was there was criminalizing and communalizing of the pandemic. And in the beginning, initially, one of the hotspots of the pandemic was a religious congregation of the minority community. And this led to a huge backlash against the minority community. So we went through that phase. And apart from that, there were like in Philippines, there have been, in India as well, there were criminal charges have been imposed for violation of lockdown rules, even against the migrant workers who were walking on foot. A large number of cases were registered against those people. And then what we've also seen is that we've seen health workers being criminally charged for speaking up, for asking better working conditions to deal with COVID-19. And then, strangely, we've also seen journalists, a large number of some 60 journalists are said to have been booked under criminal law for reporting on COVID-19. So each time there was a story on the handling of the pandemic, in the beginning especially, a lot of journalists have been charged with criminal offenses. Yeah. So moving on to the next form of authoritarianism, like the government continued its role on continued introducing illegal, unconstitutional legislations. The first thing that you saw was that the working hours to from 8 hours to 12 hours, and then this they said, and interestingly this they said was being done in the light of the pandemic. They said it was COVID is going to create such a large environment that there is need to reform labor laws in order to facilitate industries, etc. So and then they try to bring in window periods for industries. So all of this is pending in court. Some of them were struck down. Some of it is pending. Then another thing that the government is very fundamental law, which is to change the environmental protection law, which is to do with environmental clearances for industrial products. This in fact,
there seems to be a problem with your sound, Rajni.
Can you hear me? Is it better?
Better now.
Yeah, and also a time check.
Okay, yeah. So they try to bring in changes to the environmental law as well. And then apart from that, there has been major announcements to privatize the public sector and the coal sector, and also the privatization in the public system. So now that there has been resistance, and there has been so much of advocacy and statements and the media and the court interventions and the PHM has been part of a lot of these interventions. So among the popular movements that you see that I'd like to quickly read is that one existing protest that was going on in the country is reported to be back, and people are back on the streets protesting in Assam, for example. And then here that you see health workers, about 6 lakh health workers, that is more than 500,000 women health workers went on strike to demand better working conditions in the pandemic. And below here is a picture of people who were protesting and demanding work under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Law, and asking for 200 days of employment and for minimum wages as per the local employment laws. And then you had about 5 lakh coal workers, 500,000 coal workers going on to protest against privatization of coal. And then because of this huge uproar, you had the courts sometimes stepping in, trying to push back the legislative changes the government was trying to make. And then you also had the Supreme Court asking the government to send back migrant workers back home and to end criminal cases against them. And then you had a huge protest by trade unions across the country against privatization, etc. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for taking more time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rajni. And we go to our last speaker to speak on their situation in Greece, our comrade Alexis Benos from PHM Greece. Alexis?
Yes, coming. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the initiative, first of all, in the War and Conflict thematic group of PHM, which had this idea to make this webinar. And thanks to all the people of the Global Secretariat, which organized so perfectly this discussion, which is very important. Just before starting, I want to remind to all PHM members that we are now a few days before last year, where we lost our comrade, our inspirator, our leader, and dedicated friend, David Sanders. So I think he would love to be with us, and I think his spirit is with us, as he had a strong internationalist approach in the movement, and obviously he would be very, very happy to be with us. So it's we can say that this webinar could be used symbolically as a tribute also to David's memory, and hope to go on in this way as a movement. So as from my point, as I am the last and the least actually, so I'll make 5 points, 1 point per minute, so I'll do it quickly. The first is the approach of the lockdown by the Greek government. So during the first period of the lockdown, the government's campaign was centered on the personal responsibility, which is of course an approach ideal for the victim blaming approach, to put on the victim blame. So it is your fault that you are exposed. And under the name, we stay at home. This was the campaign in a country, in a population with 68% being in the limits of poverty. These are recent data, disrespecting all the people that are homeless, refugees, jailed, and all those that could not go to the supermarkets or to the pharmacies, which are elderly, chronically ill, and so on and so on. Second point, the government, instead of using the first period of relatively successful containment of the epidemic in the country, here in brackets, I want to say that Greece, in the first wave of the pandemic, was saved because of the very fringe role of Greece in the capitalist economy, in the global economy. So as all the Balkans, we were lower this period, which is opposite now because of the tourism. So instead of all these months, the government, instead of reinforcing both the public health authorities, the local CDC, and the public health services, which are in intensive care units, hiring health workers for a suffering already system due to a 10 years severe austerity policies against all public services. Instead of doing that, the government was reinforcing the police and chose a repressive policy regarding the rules of distancing and etc. As part of these policies, and due to the dismantlement of the local CDC, the management of the epidemic is given, instead of the CDC, to the primary minister's office. This reminds us perhaps the Bolsonaro, as we heard, the Bolsonaro case, okay? So the prime minister's office is now managing the epidemic, which of course they are not generals still, but anyway, they are very right-wing politicians and not at all epidemiologists. This leads to the absence of reliable data. And this, I think also, as we heard from the other panelists, it is an international issue that we don't have data, and we don't have transparency, which is severely needed in these kind of situations, circumstances, because we need transparency of data in order to make a better, to manage better the epidemic. Actually, nowadays in Greece, the only reliable data available are the number of patients in intensive care units and the number of deaths. Third point, the refugees. As you know, we have a lot of refugees coming from, especially from the borders from Turkey. The majority of them are Syrian, but we have a lot of refugees from a lot of countries of the world, which are trying to get to the paradise of the European Union and are stopped there because of the strict anti-refugees policies of the European Union and the Greek government. So especially targeting on COVID problem, on the pandemic. So the refugees, instead of being protected and dispersed in the community shelters, they are forced to stay in closed concentration camps sealed by police forces. Actually, the refugees are much more, in a much more bigger period of time, up to today, they are in lockdown. So they started locking down or putting them in concentration camps before the general lockdown, and they are still locked down. Actually, the master plan of the management of the refugees and all the issues related to that is designed based in an emergency plan of the army, which is the same we heard by the others. And this plan is designed to manage riots and threats against the internal security. So this is the way that they're managing. So this is the militarization of the epidemic into the refugees populations. In some cases, recently also we had another outbreak like this, where they found, when we have detected cases of positive cases of COVID-19 in camps, instead of isolating the patients, they are putting in the patients in the camps, and the government is forcing the personnel, all the personnel of the government or the NGOs, to quit the camp. And the camp, of course, is surrounded by police. So this is an experiment, you know, like the Mengele period. You have some cases, so you put them into the camp and you let them die in a way. In parallel, and that is also an issue that we have actually in PHM Facebook, you have a recent story about that by the Médecins Sans Frontières. The government is enhancing and provoking xenophobic and racist mobilizations in regions where are settled refugees camps. And this is also a very important issue, because in this way we have a rising fascism again in Greece against the anti-migrant movement, which is awful. And recently in the MSF clinic, they have broken down an MSF clinic in an island as part of their campaign, anti-refugees campaign. Fourth point, as a response to the repressive, and this is the good point, in a way, the optimistic point. As a response to the repressive policies and self-it approach of the government, with the initiative of active militants of social movements, a national campaign was developed all these months under the name COVID-19, No One Alone, and a diffusion of knowledge and information from a new radio station set up for this purpose, online webinars and concerts. It was a big concert with big names of the Greek music, which was a very big success online, okay? And solidarity activities such as volunteers gathering and distributing food, legal advices, etc. Solidarity campaigns for the health workers, artists. The artists are in a very bad position, I think, all over the world, because they are not considered as professionals. So they are really unemployed. Imprisoned activists, which are imprisoned because of their movement against all these policies, jailed people, and of course, refugees. Solidarity to refugees, I mean. Overall, more than 200,000 people were involved in this movement. That is a fact that it is a positive base, of course, for the resistance to come, for the new faces, for the pandemic, and against the destructive policies of the government. So this is my optimistic point, that there is a movement, and we are starting to put, instead of the selfish approach, the community approach, the population, the grassroots approach, so that we have to move against all these policies of the government. Finally, my final point is that the resistance against militarization of the international scene is not limited only to COVID management, to the pandemic management. The militarization policies promoted by continuously more authoritarian governments is a threat to the international peace. For example, in the region here of Mediterranean, which is Lebanon, Syria, Greece, Turkey, and so on, Italy, Israel, Egypt, and so on, we have now a raising tense regarding the big multinational targets of extracting oil and natural gas from the Mediterranean, which is driving a lot of bureaucracies into war conditions between the different bureaucracies. So it's a threat to the international peace that we have to confront seriously. building up an international movement against all that. That's my point. And I think, dear Chair, that I am in time.
Thank you very much, Alexis. You're in time. And now it's time for our Q&A. We have 6 in our Q&A box. The first one is, the narration of COVID-19 itself becomes a way of war narrative, as putting COVID-19 virus on one end as the only enemy. Thus, we can redefine such narrative, even the way that scientific establishment itself functions on this narrative. I think the gist of the question is, it seems that they're using COVID now as the only enemy, and anything is put in a war frame using the COVID-19 virus. Is that the trend? And how do we fight that, considering that in the scientific establishment itself is also lured into functioning in this narrative? Any of our panel, maybe call on our speakers to put on their cameras and yeah, okay. Would anyone answer the first question? The narration of COVID-19 itself becomes a way of war narrative, as putting COVID-19 virus on the other end as the only enemy. Thus, how can we redefine such narrative, even the way that scientific establishment itself functions over this narrative? Anyone?
I can respond to the first part of the question, because in Brazil it's very common to put a pathogen as an enemy in a war. We have seen this from decades with Aedes aegypti, which is a mosquito, is the vector of dengue, chikungunya, and Zika. And this is so common and very ineffective and very stupid also, because this never worked. And to deal with the problem, the population would have to have the best information possible. And the mosquito is very resilient. And the government tells people to give guidelines like don't accumulate water and the plants and so on, but the mosquito just breeds all over the place. And of course, they never do anything to better the sanitation. They don't do anything structural. They only put the mosquito as the enemy. We are in a battle against this enemy. And also it's funny because when we have epidemics, dengue, it comes and goes because we have for several types. And we have always seen the firefighters. The firefighters in Brazil are military personnel also. And they are always displaced in these epidemic moments. So right now, the general in the Ministry of Health, they justify his presence because we are at war against the virus. So no one is better than a military man to lead us against this crisis. So it's very common in Brazil.
Okay, so I think we go to the next question. The next question states, is it that the type of leadership determines the effects of the response than just the militarizing. Sri Lanka is one example where they utilized military resources in response to contain the pandemic, and it was for the benefit of the communities. How would you suggest to inform the decisions made by government to militarize is either constructive or destructive? So it seems that Sri Lanka has a more positive experience in terms of militarized interventions. So is it just the type of leadership that determines the effects of the militarization response? Anybody can answer?
Yeah, I think that is why I think that this whole link that we're trying to draw between militarization and COVID response is to argue that militarization would lead to a better COVID response is something that we shouldn't be doing at all. So even if there is proof to say that Sri Lanka, because it was militarized and because it used its military, was able to control the pandemic, was a good thing, is something that we are not saying at all. I think nobody's saying that, and the whole argument is that people, it is within people to be responding to the pandemic in a scientific manner, and it shouldn't have been through an authoritarian or a military route.
Yeah, I'm rather lost here.
Can I say something also, George?
Yes, please.
I think that because it is a combination of the two questions, actually, okay, that COVID, as any epidemic, is the first reaction is, of course, that it's an enemy that is coming from outside and so on. If we leave that to go on, and that is what is happening all over the world, is that we are trying to find enemies to other people. For example, the Greek government, when COVID started, was blaming the refugees. The prime minister was out and said that the refugees are bringing COVID. And we were really, really we had lucky that the first epidemic in Greece came by Christian fundamentalists that were in Jerusalem and came back as a group, 60 persons, and it was the first pandemic in Greece, endemic in Greece, was by Christians and not Muslims anyway. So what I want to say is that, yes, the militarization is all over. First of all, in trying to find another opponent that it's not us, it's coming from someone else. And the second is, of course, how we manage that. And of course, the military organization is the most, in all societies, the most effective organization. So in this way, it is an easy way to put the military as a response to that. But putting that, of course, we are losing democracy. And finishing that, I want to say that this is a crucial issue, I think, generally, that COVID, the epidemic, the pandemic, is used today by all the capitalist forces, from Trump to Bolsonaro and from Greece to wherever, all the world, to Sri Lanka, is used in order to make better conditions for their interests. And this is what we have to understand and put, instead of military and instead of authoritarianism, to ask to gain and to struggle for more democracy and for more community solutions.
Oh, in line with that, the third question is quite related. I would like to hear the panelists' view on the militarization of COVID's response in quote-unquote democracy states and the use of COVID measures to counteract population turbulence. Example, the Black Lives Matters in the US. So can anyone comment? How is the militarization of COVID response in so-called democracy states? just like just like how they counteract the Black Lives Matters turbulence in the US. Anyone?
Yeah, it is the same, I think, what we are just saying. And it is correct that in democracy states, we have this, for example, in the United States, we know the Black Matters Live movement and what is happening, what is the repression against them. In Greece, we have repression of people mobilizing for what I just said, the community answer to COVID. And recently, actually 2 days ago, we had GTB activist that was arrested because he was making, the police was against him because he was just walking with very racist, and homophobic comments, and he answered to them, and now he's in jail. So, I mean, it is a very important period for all governments all over the world to put more authoritarianism under the big danger, which is COVID. So don't shout at us. We have to control COVID, so we have to be more authoritarian. And this is the most dangerous issue, I think, globally.
Yeah, and in that light, I think our next question is related to that, there really is a trend in terms of the militarization of the COVID response globally. So how now can we collectively respond to such a situation? I think everybody can answer. Yes, Mike?
Yeah. The answer is obvious, but I think the People's Health Movement has to start coming up with, I saw the word evidence-based there. We can marshal our resources to show that military solutions just do not work in public health. You can use the figures, the numbers of infections, like in the Philippines, actually rising when the military comes in. But I also wanted to, being an anthropologist, I think it has to be more than numbers. I went back to history books, because when we were under the Americans in 1906, when there was a cholera epidemic, they used the military approach as well. They came in, they burned down the houses of people who had cholera. And the effect there was that people fled the city and brought cholera to the rural areas. Not only that, they hid their relatives who had cholera. They buried the dead secretly to evade the state. And it is happening again today. I said, more than 100 years after that fiasco in handling cholera, we never learned our lesson that it was the same thing. The military right now has been having problems. They wanted to, would you believe, they wanted to do house-to-house searches to look for people infected with COVID-19. They even said they would mobilize the village gossips. It was becoming so ridiculous. They would look for the gossip mongers and ask them, who have you heard having COVID-19, so we can go and get them and put them in the quarantine centers. So even quarantine came to be seen as incarceration. People did not see it as a public health measure because the military was behind it. I think the worst thing that happened as well was they would mobilize the military and the police whenever they would do mass testing. So testing came to be associated again with the coercive powers of the state rather than as a tool to help us advance public health. So all of these have to be collected. So all these stories have to be collected so that we have a good case to argue that militarization never works in public health, as well as other social problems.
Okay. Any other from the panelists who would like to answer? How can we collectively respond to such situation? of massive militarization or global, on a global scale? Okay, if none, the next question is, from almost all speakers, it is evident that the military and the use of force to enforce COVID-19 regulation is a reality, just like here in Uganda. In relation to Dr. Michael's gunpowder, what does this imply as it cuts across almost all countries today? So the gunpowder is now seen also in Uganda. So if the gunpowder mentality is prevalent, what does that imply on us, on the People's Health Movement? Mike, I think he's also reacting to your input.
Well, I'm looking for other metaphors there. When we had the EDSA revolt in 1986 that overthrew the dictator, remember, we had flowers, no? And I think Portugal's Velvet Revolution also. But that's a bit too romantic, I think. It's just that we've been arguing here in the Philippines for a more compassionate approach, an approach that helps people to understand the problem rather than using coercion. It's any person who, let me put it this way as well. No? I think a military mind, I'm sorry, I have friends who are in the military as well, but a military mind can never understand that you can use kindness and rationality to solve the problem. It's always you have to react with force. No? And so it's not surprising in the public health campaigns right now. Everything is a set of rules. This is forbidden. You will be put in prison. No one talks about the alternatives. No? And you see it globally. No? For example, and this is again going to be very romantic, no? But no one talks, for example, what are alternatives right now to hugging? Filipinos, just like Latin Americans, we are huggers. No? We cannot help but want to hug people. But the military person is never going to think of that as a problem. This compulsion, when I went and saw people I'd not seen for 3 or 4 months, we rushed to each other and we were about ready to hug. No? And we realized that no one talks about these. These are not seen as, I mean, you can imagine these macho generals. No? They're not going to talk about alternatives to hugging. No? But when you look at the newspapers, there have been beautiful instances in Spain and Italy where you get to see your grandmother and you hug her through a plastic curtain. Those things are never going to be in the agenda of the military. It's not in their language. It's not in their mind. And of course, there's much more to all of this than hugging, but they are very, very practical issues that are not being addressed.
Okay. There's a question for Rajni. You mentioned about privatization of hospitals under COVID-19. What do you mean by that? Privatization happened and it is still pushed even during the time of COVID-19. So to Rajni.
Yeah. Just before Rajni starts,
okay.
Jojo, we might have to wind up a bit in the coming minutes because the interpreters are already stretched. This is
okay. We'll have this last 2 questions. So for Rajni, the one on privatization.
So very briefly, this is something that PHM has worked on, and there is a PHM statement specifically on the privatization measures. So this was in February that the government said that it wants to bring in measures where private medical hospitals would somehow be involved in the management of district hospitals. So this was a reminder was sent in the middle of the pandemic as well to push this through. So this is what I was talking about. And it's also, the statement is on the PHM website as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay. The others are comments. There's also the introduction of traditional medicine during the time of COVID and the like. But there's one question here. Can we say that militarization of pandemic response is a proxy for the militarization that drives international capital? Who wants to answer this? The militarization of the pandemic response is a proxy for the militarization that drives international capital.
It is a way, anyway. I don't know the proxy. I mean, it is, as I said before, it is, of course, a choice that we have this threat and we have to use this threat as an opportunity to make more authoritarian policies and militarization of the global life.
Yeah. So I think in that light, and to wrap up, I mean, just as stated in the statement of the People's Health Movement, it is the insatiable thirst for profit that drives many countries, including the Europe and the US, that are causing the war and insecurity on a global scale, and also poverty and miseries for the people. And I think what we have discussed about using the COVID as cover to push forward their militarist agenda, either to stay in power or to further their neoliberal agenda, has been also seen in different countries across the globe. And the last remark is, thanks, Alex, for raising the issue of the migrants. They are not only victims of the COVID, they have been victims twice because of being in a refugee status. So in that light, I would like to thank our panel of speakers and for the short interventions. So this has been a very enlightening 2 hours for us. But I think I will call on Dr. Delen de la Paz now to give a synthesis. Delen? Are you still around, Delen? Is she on board?
Yes, okay. I am. Okay, thank you very much to all the speakers for sharing your respective experiences in your own countries. And it really is a common trend nowadays. We see that the response to the COVID-19, which is a health pandemic, has become a militarist response, and it's all trampling on the people's rights. And this is what the People's Health Movement has been saying all along, that we have to still uphold the people's right to health, but no to militarist interventions, because as Mike has said, it doesn't talk about compassion, it doesn't talk about caring, which is the essence of health. We are here to heal people, not to force them, not to coerce them. We are here to educate people so they will understand what they can do for themselves. We are here to help the people empower themselves, not to force them into subjugation. So the experiences that have been shared tonight is really something that will put together further the desire of the People's Health Movement to go on with our work of information dissemination, education, organizing, mobilizing people to take action, because without people's action, nothing can really be done. So it's in this light, I thank everybody for all this, their interventions, their positions, their sharing of their experiences. And I see that in the chat, there's also a lot of interesting comments, interesting sharing of their own experiences that's coming out. We will put all this together, and together we will continue to resist the militarist response in the COVID-19 pandemic, which is basically should be addressed in the context of health and economics, not so much in the militarist and coercive nature that government is doing now. So again, thank you so much, and we look forward to more interactive webinars like this. Please stay tuned to the next webinar that the War and conflict thematic circle of the People's Health Movement will continue to launch in the succeeding days. So thank you and have a good evening, morning, afternoon, whatever it is in your respective areas or in your own respective countries.
And
Thank
a
you.
round of
And
applause to all the interpreters for their amazing services.
yes, thank you very much to our interpreters for staying on because there would have been questions and for giving those very timely interpretation for our listeners to understand what is our respective speakers are also saying. So to everybody in the panel, Michael Tan, Elham Jameel, Maira Mathias, our Samir, Jabour, of course, our those who presented their country situations, also Rajni, Soren from India, and Alexis Benos from Greece. Thank you, and to the organizers of this webinar, the Global Secretariat of the People's Health Movement, and to Jojo, who is the coordinator of this thematic circle, Joseph Carabeo. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everybody. And those who be interested can sign up in their own country circles and the regional coordinators so we can strengthen this circle towards fostering international solidarity, action, and resistance against militarization globally. Okay, good night, good day, good afternoon, buenos días a todos. Gargaya, are we off now?